Stop touching me. Get your hands off. Chaos erupts as hotel guests face off against law enforcement in a confrontation that spirals completely out of control. Vacation dreams turned into legal nightmares when a group of travelers discovered that arguing with police doesn't end well. Ever. What began as complaints about noise levels at a Florida lodging establishment escalated into physical confrontations, arrests, and criminal charges that would follow them long after they returned home. The lesson? Sometimes keeping your mouth shut and walking away saves you from consequences you never saw coming. The evening shift supervisor faced a problem she'd dealt with countless times: visitors who refused to respect basic rules of conduct. But this particular group pushed boundaries further than most. Constant disturbances, hostile responses to reasonable requests, behavior that suggested they viewed staff as servants rather than professionals doing their jobs. After exhausting every diplomatic approach, she made the call that would change everyone's night. Multiple complaints flooded in from neighboring accommodations, volume levels that made sleep impossible, aggressive language directed at employees trying to maintain order, the kind of entitlement that treats paying for a service as permission to act without consequences. Management's attempts at conflict resolution had failed completely, leaving law enforcement as the only remaining solution. The group's reservation period was nearly finished, departure scheduled within hours, but allowing them to remain posed unacceptable risks. Liability concerns, complaints from other paying guests, potential property damage, and staff safety all factored into management's decision. They wanted immediate removal, and they were willing to press charges if necessary to make it happen. When officers arrived at the accommodations to explain the eviction, they encountered exactly what you'd expect: immediate defensiveness, claims of innocence, protests that they'd done nothing to deserve this treatment. The narrative they constructed painted themselves as victims of unfair persecution, innocent travelers being harassed by unreasonable management for no legitimate reason. Their story emphasized that they'd just returned to the property moments earlier, that they couldn't possibly have violated policies because they'd been absent all day. They insisted cameras would vindicate them, that reviewing footage would prove management's accusations were baseless. The problem? Officers weren't there to adjudicate disputes or review security recordings. They were there to enforce a legal trespass order, period. Protests continued even as officers explained that management's decision was final. Whether the accusations were fair, whether the guests felt wronged, whether they deserved refunds, none of that mattered legally. Private property owners have broad authority to remove anyone they choose, and once that decision is made, cooperation becomes legally mandatory regardless of personal feelings about fairness. The group couldn't accept this reality. They kept arguing about deposits, about money they'd paid, about their rights as customers. Officers patiently explained that financial disputes had to be resolved separately from the immediate requirement to vacate. Stay and argue, and you're committing trespass. Leave peacefully, and you can fight about refunds later through proper channels. Instead of gathering belongings and departing, they dug in. More arguments, more justifications, more insistence that reviewing cameras would prove their innocence. Officers' patience began wearing thin as minutes stretched into extended confrontation. Simple compliance would have ended this in minutes. Continued resistance was transforming a civil matter into potential criminal charges. Eventually, someone started packing, but the process moved at glacial speed. Officers grew increasingly frustrated as guests continued debating rather than departing. At this point, their continued presence in the accommodations constituted criminal trespass. They'd been ordered to leave by both property management and law enforcement, and they were refusing. That's when things got complicated. Someone noticed cash on a counter that hadn't been there moments before. Officers immediately became suspicious. Where did money come from? Who placed it there? The explanations offered didn't satisfy their concerns, and what had been a simple eviction suddenly involved questions about potential criminal activity beyond just trespass. One individual claimed the accommodation was registered in her name, giving her authority to pack belongings for family members. Officers weren't interested in family dynamics or who held reservation rights. Everyone needed to exit immediately, and continued delays would result in arrests. The warnings were clear, explicit, and repeatedly stated. Physical resistance began when one person refused direct orders to leave. Instead of walking out when commanded, she sat down and continued arguing. Officers moved to physically remove her, and she pulled away, triggering exactly the escalation that could have been avoided with simple compliance. Hands-on enforcement became necessary because verbal commands had failed. Once officers initiated physical contact, the situation exploded. Screaming about rights violations, demands to know why she was being touched, protests that she'd done nothing wrong. Other guests started recording on phones, adding to the chaos. What could have been resolved with a quiet walk to the parking lot became a physical struggle captured on multiple cameras. Handcuffs came out. The arrested individual escalated her resistance, making officers' jobs significantly harder. She screamed about documenting everything, about police brutality, about being from New York, as if geographic origins somehow granted immunity from Florida law. Each moment of resistance added charges and guaranteed a worse outcome than simple compliance would have produced. As she was being secured, protests intensified. Claims of not being able to breathe, demands for medical attention, accusations that officers were using excessive force. Family members shouted encouragement and criticism. The scene devolved into complete chaos, all because nobody would simply walk away when given the chance. Additional individuals got involved trying to help, which only made things worse. Officers now had to manage multiple people simultaneously, all claiming innocence, all insisting they were just trying to retrieve belongings or assist family members. What they perceived as helping, officers saw as interference and continued trespass. The arrested woman kept screaming that she'd only been trying to leave, that she'd done nothing to justify this treatment. But body camera footage would tell a different story. Repeated refusal of lawful orders, physical resistance when officers attempted removal, escalating confrontation when compliance would have prevented everything. As she was placed in the patrol vehicle, protests continued. Demands for her property, insistence that she lived in New York as if that mattered, claims of medical emergencies designed to delay transport. Officers had heard it all before, the standard playbook people use when they realize resistance hasn't worked and consequences are real. Family members shouted that everyone knew where she was going, that they'd come get her, that this would all be documented and dealt with legally. The arrested woman alternated between screaming about medical needs and hurling accusations at officers, trying every tactic to avoid the inevitable ride to jail. When asked why she was under arrest, she genuinely seemed confused. Officers patiently explained: battery on law enforcement, trespass after warning, resisting arrest. Her response revealed the disconnect. She believed that because she'd paid for the accommodation, she couldn't be arrested. Geography doesn't grant immunity, and payment doesn't override legal authority. Additional guests were detained. One woman insisted she'd just been trying to help family members, that she had nothing to do with the original disturbance. Officers didn't care about her narrative. She'd been ordered to leave, refused, and continued interfering. That made her complicit in the trespass, regardless of her intentions. In custody, the arrested woman demanded to know specific charges, emphasizing repeatedly that she'd paid for the accommodation. Officers explained that Florida law doesn't care where you're from or whether you've paid for services. Commit crimes, face consequences. It's that simple. When a female officer arrived to conduct searches before jail transport, the arrested woman asked why she was being held. The officer explained clearly, this wasn't detention, this was arrest. There's a difference, and understanding that difference matters when you're heading to a cell rather than going home. The arrested woman tried comparing her situation to serious crimes, suggesting police should focus on real problems. Officers weren't interested in debating enforcement priorities. She'd committed offenses, they'd arrested her, and she was going to jail. The conversation ended there. During the search process, protests continued about rough treatment, about rights being violated, about the unfairness of everything. Officers maintained professional composure while methodically checking for contraband before jail intake. Every complaint was noted and ignored. When informed she was charged with battery on law enforcement, the woman exploded with denials. No punching, no hitting, no physical contact whatsoever. The officer calmly explained that battery doesn't require striking someone. Any unwanted physical contact during resistance qualifies, including pushing away from officers attempting lawful detention. The search continued despite constant complaints. Officers checked clothing, belongings, hair accessories, everything that might conceal contraband before jail entry. The arrested woman provided running commentary about how unfair and unnecessary everything was, as if protests would somehow reverse her situation. Another woman faced similar processing, claiming she'd only tried to help and had nothing to do with the original incident. Officers didn't accept her narrative. She'd interfered, refused to leave, and gotten arrested as a result. Her motivations didn't matter. Her actions determined consequences. As processing concluded, arrested individuals were loaded into transport vehicles for the ride to county jail. Protests continued about unfairness, about being from out of state, about doing nothing wrong. Officers had heard identical claims from thousands of arrestees over the years. None of it changed the outcome. One woman kept insisting she'd just been trying to assist family members, that she'd committed no crime. Officers ignored the narrative. She'd been present. She'd refused to leave. She'd interfered with law enforcement. Those facts guaranteed her a cell next to her relatives. All suspects arrived at Orange County Jail facing charges: trespass after warning, resisting arrest. One woman faced additional charges of battery on law enforcement for physical contact during resistance, though that charge would eventually be dropped by prosecutors reviewing the case. The entire disaster was completely avoidable. Walk out when asked, deal with refund disputes later through proper channels, and everyone goes home. Instead, egos and entitlement transformed a hotel eviction into criminal records, legal fees, and a story these individuals will carry for years. Sometimes the smartest thing you can say to police is absolutely nothing at all, especially when you've already lost and just don't know it yet.